What's up, guys? It's Jeron with Savage Gym. Today I want to take a little bit of time and talk to you about some of the strategies that I use for picking lift attempts at a powerlifting meet on meet day. Now, first of all, I want to thank Bryce Lewis for his great resource with the attempt selection chart. As you can see with the one that I've posted here, I actually stole a lot of the content that he had in that, so thank you to him. For putting that resource out there. I've just kind of modified it to include a little bit more information that I end up giving to my lifters on meet day, so that way they've got a couple extra pieces of information to help them out as well. So just kind of breaking down into it, there are a couple of key differences between picking attempts for a powerlifting competition and just how to set up your attempts for maxing out each individual lift. And I think the biggest piece that is missing when lifters are trying to pick attempts is they forget the purpose, or maybe they have a miscalibrated expectation with what the goal of doing well in a powerlifting meet really entails. Now, I've made a lot of mistakes as far as attempt selection with myself in the past, which is kind of how I've ended up with the little bit more conservative approach that I use now. But in the time that I have moved towards something more along these lines, the number of lifts that my lifters are making in competition has gone up significantly, as have their totals and placings as well. And I attribute a lot of that to this little bit more pragmatic approach towards picking attempts. Historically, where I have hurt my own performance is I've gone into the meet with the expectation of PRing each of my individual lifts. And while some of this was based on how training was going, I went into it with the expectation of, well, I've peaked, my squat, bench, and deadlift, so I want to squat this much, bench this much, and deadlift this much on competition day. And while this may happen earlier on in your training career, the longer that you continue to compete, the less likely this is to happen. And it also fails to take into consideration all of the other variables that go into actually competing in powerlifting. For example, if you're just maxing out a lift in the gym and it's a single lift, you don't have to take into consideration the effect the other two lifts will have on that lift. So if you deadlift just on one day, you are only deadlifting, and the max that you're going to hit in that context is going to be different than the max deadlift that you hit after 3 heavy squat attempts and all the warm-ups, and 3 heavy bench attempts and all the warm-ups for that. The other thing is you may also not factor in a weight cut, if any, and the effect that will have on your performance, or travel to a meet, or even just the stress of having to warm up under less than ideal situation, such as working in with 15 other lifters on 2 squat racks, maybe not being able to rest as long as you like between your last warm-up and your first attempt, or even being able to control the amount of rest time that you have between your attempts, because the order on meet day shuffles according to the subsequent attempts that each of the lifters put in. And because of this, if you don't take these things into consideration, it can cause you to make some really poor choices as far as the attempts that you try to take in a competition. So because of all of those things, and because I've gone in and tried to hit very specific numbers regardless of whether or not they were there on the day, I've had a few meet totals that were very much under what I would have been capable of doing had I actually looked at my my strategy towards putting together a good total a little bit more thoroughly. So that's one important thing to consider. The other important thing that I think gets forgotten by newer lifters is the fact that we compete based on total, not based on the individual maxes in the lifts. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can end up putting together a total, and not all of them, or even the most ideal totals, are put together with just hitting PRs in all 3 of your lifts. It takes a little bit of maturity, and it takes the ability to really pay attention to how things are moving and how you're feeling on meet day, to extract as many pounds out of each of the lifts as possible without going over and missing. Because if you jump too far on maybe a 3rd attempt just because you want to hit a certain number, I've done this with 600 on my deadlift on a handful of occasions before I pulled it. You get caught up into that, but you also run the risk of missing that lift and being stuck with whatever your 2nd attempt was, which then costs pounds on your total. And so, as you can see here in this chart, what I do when trying to strategize for my lifters is I try to put together a handful of possible scenarios. I use this as a little bit of a strategy sheet for myself as a coach, just because I've gotten to watch how the lifters have performed in training over the usually 12 or more weeks leading into a competition. I know them as people, and I know their psychology. I know, who tends to perform better under competition type situations and who tends to perform worse. I know who does better with bigger jumps between attempts, and I know who needs to have their attempts placed closer together because they tend to get nervous if they can feel a large change in weight. I know who tends to have plenty of energy at the end of a meet day. I know who tends to get tired. And I know who, is more likely to be nervous and who is going to be more confident on game day. So all of those things go into picking a good meet day strategy. So as a coach, I kind of sit down and I take a couple hours and I plan out a sheet, something like this, for each of my lifters. That way I have an idea of the jumps that I'm going to have them take. But also what it does is it helps to calibrate their expectations of what can happen on meet day as well. Granted, I make all of these calls kind of on the fly based on how the lifts are looking. It pretty much is always in line with what I've laid out on the sheet here. Brings us to the attempts themselves. Now, first off is going to be the openers, and I take a little bit different approach with the opening squat than I do with the opening bench press and the deadlift, mostly because this is going to be the first lift of the entire day. You're going to have your nerves at their highest and at their worst at this point, and pretty much up until this point, nothing about doing the meet is fun. Everything's fun after the opening squat. Everything up until the opening squat is a little bit nerve-wracking. So I tend to set the opening squat a little bit lower than I would with the other attempts. A general rule of thumb that I use is with your opener, it should be something you could hit for a triple with a hangover on a bad day. And so I go a little bit less than that with the opening squat. As you can kind of see here with the percentages on the side, it's the only one that opens under 90%. Again, this is going to differ based on you as a lifter or who you're setting attempts for. But I like to stay somewhere around 90%. Or slightly under. That way it's something that you can almost treat like a final warm-up. You're going to go out, you're going to smash it, you're going to get 3 whites, you're going to come up confidently, and it's going to set the tone for you and the rest of the day emotionally. I would much rather have a lifter hit their opening squat, smash it, and be confident and in the meet than have them hit it, have it feel heavy, and then the rest of the day, at least in their head, it just feels pretty crappy. On the opening bench press, that is, again, going to be something that you could triple on a bad day. The opening deadlift is going to depend on how that person's energy reserves typically are. So depending on the lifter, I'll either open somewhere around 90% or sometimes a little bit less just to conserve energy and get a good idea of what to do for the subsequent attempts. For all 3 of the lifts, your opener should be something that sets you up for your second attempt and lets you know kind of where you're at for the day with that lift. It should be kind of like a last warm-up and an indicator for where to go for the second, and the second should set you up for where you're going to be at with the third attempt. The next thing I want to call your attention to is the 3 different possible scenarios for second and third attempts on each of the lifts. Now, I have on this sheet here the weights in both kilograms and in pounds, just so that way it's easy to kind of translate those things or easy to put the attempts in. And I also have percentages on the right column of each of those 3 columns as well. So you can kind of get an idea of some of the percentage ranges that we're looking at with meet day attempts, as well as what a couple of those scenarios might look like for somebody who has the maxes that I do up in those corners there. So as you can see here, in an ideal scenario where everything is going 100% according to plan, the first, second, and third attempts are in the middle shade of reddish kind of color there. And this is if everything is just straight according to plan, not feeling exceptionally great, not feeling exceptionally shitty, but just straight across the board. These are what we should be able to hit, with the third attempts being something right around 100%. And in addition to these categories, sorry about that, I also have a low and a high, or a safe and a reach category for the second and third attempts. This is because of all the variables that can happen on meet day. We need to be prepared for less than ideal scenarios and maybe not coming in and hitting the specific numbers that we set out to hit at a competition. So what this does is it lets us set up to still pull as many pounds out of the lift as possible if things aren't feeling well, by having attempts that we are guaranteed to make. In general, the lifter who makes more attempts is going to total higher and do better in competition. This also helps to build confidence, because every time that you miss a lift, you're more likely to create a mental block around that particular number. So what this does here is it lets us actually really play the day as it's dealt to us, and gives them opportunities for maybe taking a guaranteed attempt so that way we can build the total, a third attempt if everything is going as we're planned, or if things are feeling exceptionally well, then it lets us push a little beyond what our predetermined numbers are and actually take advantage of the opportunity to take a PR. Even in any of these situations though, the goal is not just to hit that 100+% PR, it's just for us to perform as well as we can and put together the biggest total as possible. So hopefully that's helpful. As you can see at the bottom there, I also do tend to include warm-up sequences as well. Obviously on meet day, we want to get warmed up and ready to lift the heaviest weights possible, but we want to do it in as fresh a state as possible. So I tend to keep the reps on the warm-ups relatively low after we get past the lighter weights, and really just space those out so that way we can get acclimated to the weight, but we're not taking more attempts than necessary. So hopefully that is helpful. Feel free to copy this sheet if it's something that is useful for you. Or if you want a better one that's not just a screenshot here, I suggest going over to thestrengthathlete.com and checking out the original version of the attempt selection sheet that Bryce Lewis published that is freely available as a resource for you. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment in the box below, and be sure to check out the gym's website at savagegym.com. Thank you and take care.